to the InnerVerse. It's an illusion.
Welcome to the One Within All to the InnerVerse podcast. I'm your host, Chance, and it's time to set your phasers to weird as we are cracking the Mythic egg and scrambling up another consciousness-enriching feast for your ears today. Picking up off our previous episode with Mark Gober about the contact phenomenon, this time around we have quite the well-seasoned researcher, a legend in the field of UFO and contact phenomenon, Keith Thompson. I will attempt to keep my introduction brief this time, as there is so much to discuss from Keith's brand new book that I don't want to miss a thing. In the UFO Paradox, the celestial and symbolic world of unidentified aerial phenomena, Keith shares his insights of an investigative career spanning all the way back to when he was 12 years old, with an underlying premise perfectly summarized by a quote from St. Augustine that miracles do not happen in contradiction to nature, but only in contradiction to that which is known to us of nature. As Keith says in his book, in the UFO allegory, the surface-level debate that goes on in the public square inevitably casts a spell that masks deeper and more difficult questions about the very nature of reality. The great abundance of controversy, the arguments about flyovers, landings, close encounters, secret rumors, and rumors of secrets, strained official denials, and of course the alien abductions, practically instructs the reader to go beyond the increasingly baroque surface into the depths. In this way, allegory casts its spell, but not by conveying that there's nothing to the surface arguments about what UFOs are and where they are from, but instead by making it clear that there's something else to be seen and understood. Ultimately, what gets communicated beyond words is that finding answers about the nature and origins of extraordinary otherworld beings almost certainly will require us to come to terms with who and what we are, or the farther reaches of our own nature. That's what I love so much about this book. Unlike many other researchers in the field, instead of fitting the data into an overarching conclusion, we're asking the question, why can't we figure this out, rather than, what is this? In this conversation, we'll explore the possibility that the UFO phenomenon is a call from the cosmos or universal consciousness itself. Check the show notes for links to Keith's new book and all the ways you can support InnerVerse. And buckle your seatbelts for an episode that may just change the way you think about reality itself. Everyone, please welcome the philosophical idealist investigator of inner terrestrials and professor of protean possibilities, Keith Thompson. Welcome to the show, man. And thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Chance. What a great introduction. And I mean that because it's you really have delved deeply and you brought up some of the big ideas that I seldom even get to discuss. So we're starting at the beginning with the depths, which I'm all for.
That's kind of what I see as the theme of this show as we go straight to the deep end. This is not the entry-level audience. We've got researchers, practitioners of mystical and woo things, This is definitely the place where you can stretch your legs and explore the stuff that you find most interesting. But let's start right here. A main theme of the book is challenging the long-running common conception that UFOs or UAPs are visitors from other planets. You say, this assumption of equivalence continues to this day. So you believe in UFOs is almost always heard as, so you believe in extraterrestrial life, which translates to, do you believe UFOs are visiting ET spaceships? Then UFO proponents and debunkers take to their familiar stands on the kabuki dance floor. I think the audience is quite a long way past the UFOs are from other planets exit and are speeding down the highway towards the unknown at admirable speed. But to open up this discussion, what would you add to this opening quote?
Well, they could be from outer space. They could be exactly or similar to what Steven Spielberg has presented. I will tell you a funny little story about this. You may already know that the great French astrophysicist, astronomer Jacques Vallée, who has been a very important voice in this field for generations. He's nearly 90, maybe older now, but he's still at it. I happened to see him a few months ago, and he's as mercurial and hermetic and wise and playful as ever. He was called upon the movie scene to advise Steven Spielberg in the making of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And, the French scientist in that movie, Lacombe, was based, or you may not know, was based on Jacques Vallée. So it's interesting. The alien scientist was Jacques Vallée. In any case, while they were working on the movie, Jacques said to Spielberg, he said, and I have a hard time not doing Vallée's beautiful French accent, not that I do it justice, but he said, Stephen, what you're doing is very interesting, but this phenomenon is far more subtle than just an extraterrestrial. The information that I've given you. And Spielberg stopped him. He said, Jacques, I absolutely agree with you. I've looked at this. I've looked at what you've sent me. I've read your books. And it's clear that the extraterrestrial hypothesis as it's normally conceived is not the only game in town. It doesn't even fit the complexity of the data as we would hope, in an ideal sense. But then he also said, the point I want to make to you, Jacques, I work in Hollywood. My job is to make a successful movie. I want to be a blockbuster. And people expect UFOs to have to do with outer space. I understand your point is they have to do with the very question of what is the distinction between inner and outer space. I fully understand that, but that would go over the heads of my audience. And Jacques said, but just as long as you're clear that we understand each other, I'd be glad to help advise to make the best space blockbuster that you can make. So in any case, that kind of summarizes what it is. It could be from outer space, but there are facts from the phenomenon related to the phenomenon that simply don't support that, and that make, at least in a final sense, support it in a definitive sense. They could be from other galaxies, but not necessarily spacecraft. They could also be from right here on this Earth, from some parallel corridor, some parallel civilization, but not necessarily of our own making. So where is here? Where is there? These are deep questions that this phenomenon surfaces. So with that as my opening, let's see where we go.
Totally. Something about me, I do a type of energy work that I do at a distance. And every single time I engage the practice, I both receive the experience and provide the experience that distance and separation are mental concepts, and that our mind is not in our body is in our mind. So once we take that framework of our reality, the consciousness first, the work that you cite so heavily from Bernardo Kastrup and other physicists who are grokking this whole totality, and then the question of where it's from, where becomes a little less relevant than the symbolic interpretation of the experience itself. And I like that about your book most of all, is that it's reality, the illusion, the allegory aspect of the reality of these experiences. I think that's the fascinating lens to really put on for the whole conversation as we proceed.
Well, let me say something about that. I worked up to the allegory idea. Most people are not, the idea of let's discuss the UFO phenomenon in terms of an allegory. People recognize, wait a minute, isn't allegory a kind of a literary genre? We're not going to turn this into a literary category, but it's really not the point I'm making. An allegory is a very interesting literary device. It allows you to tell a story at the surface level, meaning what the words say. For example, Orwell's Animal Farm. At the surface level, at the level that the words write about, it is a story of barnyard animals who have relationships and they form a community. And there are dynamics and characters and plots, but this book can be read as a children's book. But in so reading the book, the mind is instantly aware that it's pointing to another level all along. And it's Orwell's genius. Instead of writing a tract against political authoritarianism, which he, by the way, wrote his share of really good essays about political authoritarianism and about the oppressive society. He's especially concerned about the Stalinist Russia of the previous century. But in any case, he made the barnyard story of the animals, especially the pigs who were the bad guys, an allegory for this deeper story. But the surface level about the animals never refers to the hidden story, never refers to the sunken story, the story below. And the story below is the symbolic, the deeper story. Another example of an allegory, just to put one more on the table, is Franz Kafka. We know Kafka because his literature is so famous. It's called Kafkaesque. Oh boy, was I ever in a Kafkaesque situation this week. It's become an adjective for when you're really stuck somewhere. So Kafka wrote a story of a novel called The Trial about a man named Joseph K. And within the first few sentences, and definitely the first page in the first chapter, we learn that Joseph K. has been taken to jail. He's on trial. He hasn't been told what the charges are. And yet he is obligated to stand trial for something he doesn't even know what he's accused of. And at a surface level, that's a compelling story, but we're instantly aware as we read it, he's making a larger existential statement. Don't we all know what it's like to be accused of something? But it's never clear what. So he could make that larger point by keeping that story implied. So there's the explicit story and the implicit. And the way I take that into the UFO phenomenon is this. This is a story about flyovers, apparent craft, deeply informed by generations of outer space movies, hardware, military industrial motifs, post-war themes. And yet the nature of the events calls into question the fundamental dividing line in Western science between the objective and the subjective, the outer and the inner, the material and the psychological or symbolic. For example, by definition, a synchronicity, which we probably will be talking about, is a form of a Carl Jung collaborated with the physicist Johann Pauli. I believe it's Johann Pauli. I'm not sure about the first name right now, but in any case, we work together to define this kind of reality where there are meaningful coincidences. There's convergences between events that happen in the physical world that have psychic meaning and that involve that officially in the materialist worldview are simply coincidences. For example, you have been thinking of a friend from high school 20 years ago, been in your mind for a few days. You think, oh, maybe I'll get in touch with my old friend Jim. Phone call comes. You pick it up. He says, hey, Keith, you won't believe it. This is Jim from high school. Been thinking about you. That's a direct hit. That's a synchronicity. That is not a likely, now, of course, materialism calls that merely a coincidence because there can't be that kind of overlap between the material and the physical. The reason I cite that is because the UFO phenomenon is filled with paranormal, psychic phenomena, so that it begins to look like this is a phenomena that is supernature writ large. And so that's the way I approach it. I don't dismiss the possibility that it could, that some of what falls under the acronym UFO, now UAP, could be extraterrestrial ships. But if they are, here's how they behave. They come in, they appear to be craft, they appear to be physical events, they're caught on radar and other sensors, they show a placement in time and space similar to geometric measurements, they have a heat signature, they have a thermal imprint, they just really qualify as physical or material events. So that allows the hardware school of UFO research to say they're physical events. So then this is where these people then sort of leave the conversation, because sometimes these very events which have established the criterion of physical events then split into two or three, change shape and form. Some of them drop into the ground and disappear. Some dissolve into orbs of colored light and fly off into the sky, and so forth. That suddenly changes the complexion. This is a phenomenon that in one phase was clearly a material event and then changes into an immaterial, or it's like a physical and anti-physical phenomena built into one. That is a contradiction, and that's a paradox. So that's what we're dealing with. It's why Western science is not very good. Most of the skeptics on this subject are not really skeptics. They take the role of what I call debunkers, which is really not a scientific enterprise to simply rule a phenomenon out of bounds categorically. They'll say things like, that didn't happen because we know that can't happen, because we know the laws of nature are such that it can't happen. Well, there's just a lot that needs to be unpacked in that. Can't happen. The laws of nature are not ever complete. It was like that phrase we heard during COVID, the science is settled. I'm not going to open up the COVID controversy, but at the level of this discussion, when the science is settled, we're not talking science anymore. When it's a scientific consensus, that ain't science anymore. It's public relations. That's spinning. Science is not a finished product. It's an ongoing process of inquiry. That's my approach to the phenomenon in this book.
It's cool that you touched on, I call it cooties. Helps me avoid the censors, and it allows me to express my derision for the whole debacle. But, going into the Jungian sense, the synchronicity, the symbolic nature of reality, what I experience all the time in my practice as a holistic healer is that symptoms are symbols. And I believe that the fact we've gotten so far away from that intrinsic knowing and knowing ourselves, that just like I'm sure Jung would probably agree that when people integrate their synchronicities, they bridge the gap between their inner and outer world. They find themselves healthier, more vital, maybe even resolving symptoms. I got to tell an anecdote because a client that I had this previous week, it was her second session. And in the first session, she came to me for tachycardia that had onset recently. Heart racing, palpitating for hours at a time, couldn't get to the bottom of it. And longer story short, what emerged in the session that I found in her energy field was the memory of an ancestor who had been traumatized by the bombings in London. And when we resolved that on the energy field level, integrated that, her tachycardia experience went from hours at a time to sometimes coming up for just a few moments, and we did another session to explore further. And here's where it gets even more weird on the synchronicity level is what I uncovered in that was a memory of her mother-in-law passing away and how she did not realize that experience had implanted or conditioned an extreme fear in her of the bereavement of her family members if she were to die suddenly of a mysterious illness that she was afraid of subconsciously because of this onset of this weird heart issue. And after we finished the session, she told me, this morning, before I came in to sit down in this guest room to do this session with you, I had this strange urge to resolve a project I'd been intending to do for many, many months. And that was the reframing of a photograph of my mother-in-law, who's been dead for over 20 years. So it just been sitting there needing to be reframed. She reframed it and then answered the call to join the session with me. And the thing that I find in her energy field that's most impactful to her current issue is a memory revolving around her deceased mother-in-law. That is the synchronicity that allows for healing, the bridging of that inner-outer world gap. That's the experience that I think is always available to us in reality, that is synonymous with truth, that it's always somewhere in your perception, whether it's symbolic or obvious. And that's the lens I like to always bring to people's attention. Like, don't get hung up on, because you bring so much of the mythology of just human history to the table, which I love, the border between mythology and history, that whole Delphian oracle phrase that's so often quoted, know thyself, encapsulates what we're talking about. But what is much less frequently quoted from that inscription is the next line, certainty brings ruin. And I think that's part of what's baffled this whole field of study is people develop a type of certainty that impedes all forward progress.
Oh, beautiful. I'm reminded of a quote attributed to Einstein. I frame it that way because, Einstein is credited with everything these days, these memes that we see online. And I realized that's the Buddha. That's not Einstein. But in any event, one that seems plausible is he said, is alleged to have said, whether he said it or not, I like the thought. The more that I study physics, the more I want to understand metaphysics. Because he understood that what he could work with in physics seemed to keep pointing to a larger frame that wasn't really his business, so to speak, as a physicist. But he understood that line between metaphysics and physics is important. And you just touched on something. I've never talked about this in relationship with to this subject or to anomalies, but it's a favorite framework for me to work with or talk about. And that is, there was a psychotherapist in the United States, psychiatrist named Carl Whitaker for many years, wasn't famous. He worked in the psychoanalytic worldview, the psychiatric paradigm, which means he sat with a patient and talked about issues, normally family issues involving mom and dad. That's mostly what Freudianism is about. And he kept having a sense there was something about this way of working with patients that wasn't quite right. So one day at the end of a session with the young woman that he'd been seeing on a regular basis, he said he was originally a farm boy from Wisconsin, and he never really got over that. So he had that persona. He said to her, well, our time is up again. I've been noticing that you continue to talk about these people named mom and dad and sister and brother and grandpa and nephew and niece. Why don't you bring some of them in with you sometime? We can all talk. And she said, well, we can't do that. That isn't how psychotherapy works. He said, well, it could work that way. You talk about these people secondhand. I don't doubt that you're telling the truth as you understand it. What if we get their perspective? And she said, well, I don't even know what that would look like. I can't ask my parents to come into therapy. He said, well, all right, let it go for now. So after the session, he walked out. He was in a practice with his colleagues. And during the next meeting, sort of the group and get together to talk about cases, he brought up this idea with his colleagues. And they said, well, Carl, she's right. You can't do that. It's called breaking the frame. The framework is the therapist and the patient, one-on-one. He said, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to break the damn frame because I think that the patient is the family. They said, what do you mean? So he began to talk about it, began to put his ideas. Now, this was not something he came up with alone. It was a growing, the zeitgeist. Something was growing in the awareness of American therapists in the 50s and 60s. And that was that there are family systems that present problems. There's sometimes problems are systemic, and in fact, they're multi-generation. So in his work, as he developed this premise, he began to insist that he shifted his practice so that the patients who would come in would bring family members with them. And it would always turn out, or very often would turn out, that one member of the family was the problem. And everybody in the family agreed that Johnny, the teenager, is a problem. He's got the problem. We all agree on that. That became, to Carl Whitaker's perspective, a sign that Johnny was not the problem. Johnny was the scapegoat. Johnny was the identified patient. He was identified as everybody else as the problem. He was the symptom bearer for the family. So when Johnny would come, when the family would come in and Johnny would be part of it, he said, oh, you must be Johnny. Well, I'm Dr. Whitaker. You come over here and sit next to me and you can just watch. There won't be much expected of you because you're the talk of everybody all the time anyway. So what he did right there was shift the system. He provoked the system. He perturbed the system itself because mom and dad came expecting that Carl Whitaker would agree, how are we going to solve Johnny's problem, which might involve drugs, might involve girls, whatever. So you see the point. He gradually began to identify who's holding the symptoms for the family. And when that was the focus, it turned out that other members of the family had unresolved problems, and everybody got to be treated, and the family system could become healthier. So what's that to say? Well, part of what it's to say was that he began to understand that when he would invite multi-generations of family members, including grandpa, grandma, who don't even have a stake in what's going on in the nuclear family, get them to come in. And what would gradually surface is there often were generational stories, generational traumas in the field. Now, that was not, Whitaker did not work with a psychic framework. He didn't talk about energy fields, but he was very close to that at times because he understood that he was treating a field of symptoms that might involve people who were long dead. So I had that opportunity to meet with him once. To talk with him at a seminar that I did. I was not a psychotherapist, but I found him a great philosopher of life. And he said, oh, yeah, I work with the dead all the time. And he smiled. He said, you know what I mean by that? I work with the ghosts in the family that are still present because they are carrying something for the rest of the family. So I put that out there as just a place where we could go off to something next, but as a framework for understanding the very unresolved trauma tends to be carried forward. And in fact, that might be a way to link it back to the UFO topic. Because let's say with the abductions, whatever's going on in these alien abductions, there's a widespread belief, widespread part of the phenomenon is that they're often multi-generational, that these events have been going on in the family. So grandma was interacting with unusual beings, and her mother was. But somebody else had psychokinesis in the family, and there was telepathy. So when you probe a multi-generational abduction story, you've got to be prepared to find multi-generational paranormal phenomena as well.
Yeah, that, and you allude to at one point in the book the way that extreme childhood trauma does seem to potentially unlock these paranormal experiences too. And the psychologist you're talking about kind of reminds me of the work of more recent work of a guy named Richard Schwartz, who developed a system called internal family systems. But rather than bringing the entire extended family into the session, he actually worked the angle of the multiplicity of selves within one psyche. And that has so many potential components that it kind of becomes limitless. It's like it responds to the way that you ask things. You can talk to different parts of self. And it seems overall, because I'm really interested in all things effective when it comes to psychosomatic healing modalities, that the parts model of psyche is a much more effective overall if it's a parts-based model. And that tends to have the best results. And on the notion of like ghosts in the family, I can't tell you how many times I've worked with somebody's energy field and resolved maybe issues they had with a mother that they were estranged with. And then the mother calls them or texts them for the first time in years in the day or two after the session, or worked with a generational trauma energy in one person, but from a field perspective. And they report back to me that another member or two members of the family also resolved the tendency that was based on that trauma. So that's really interesting. And to me, I'm glad we're talking about psychology, because the most fulfilling aspect of the book was the way you fold depth psychology into the analysis, where you keep the high strangeness, the synchronicity, the cosmological idealism at the forefront in every chapter. So I think it's important to establish some of those concepts as we're somewhat early in the conversation with a leap off the Jungian high dive into the idea that the greater part of the soul exists outside of the body, and the meaningful coincidences of events separated by time or space, the happenings that suggest secret symmetries between consciousness and matter. Like, those were my favorite ideas in the UFO Paradox.
Well, that's absolutely great insight on your part. I did not keep a separate chapter that, although there's one chapter near the end where I do go into the depth analysis more deeply, and that is through Bernardo Kastrup, the philosopher in Europe who is doing such great work to value the role of consciousness. But I tried to keep that level going throughout the entire book. So it's an unusual combination of history, psychology, you might say spirituality, certainly mythology. I've often been asked, what is your thinking, Keith? Why did you bring in mythology? What is the relevance of the Greek figure Hermes, for example, or the Roman version Mercury? They're trickster figures, very frankly, and the phenomenon, whether it's intent or not, whether it is its intent or not its intention, has a trickster-like it has a trickster-like effect on the entire debate. It subverts expectations at every turn. It confounds the dividing line between mind and matter, outer and inner, symbol and fact. And so I brought in Hermes and other trickster figures, Coyote, Raven, and so forth, simply because I think we need a different kind of thinking. Also, because this phenomenon could easily be not just predating 1947, the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting of flying saucers over Mount Rainier. This could be a very ancient phenomenon that is precisely so elusive because our modes of thinking, the rational, logical, Apollonian, as in the Greek god Apollo, who demands clear-cut, crystal clear, yes or no, this or that, binary choices. That whole way of thinking could be based on Aristotelian logic, binaries. This phenomenon could be much deeper than that. It could in fact, I think it is. I think this phenomenon is deeper. Linguistic analysts, those who understand the human linguistic apparatus, suggest that our way of knowing, the human cognitive mode, is maybe 30,000 years old. Well, that's sure not exactly just a few seconds in terms of an individual life. That's a long time. But in terms of cosmic time, 30,000 years is just a blink of an eye, even less. So what's my point? This, the mode of logic, the modes of cognition that we have settled on in the modern human experiment could be far more restrictive than the phenomenon itself. This phenomenon may have more degrees of freedom than our maps and our way of approaching it allow. Why would we assume that a primate on a rock planet, a watery rock planet, has exhausted through its logical framework all of the possibilities, ontological possibilities? We can't assume that at all. So that's a long answer to why do I bring in mythology? Because we need different ways. Think mythologically, because the phenomenon may be thinking mythologically. We need to think in terms of riddles. We need to think in terms of fairy tales, because in the fairy tales of the Grimm brothers is some of the deepest literature, framework, portrayals of, especially the unedited Grimm brothers, the ones that are not meant for just children. The Grimm brothers were truly grim. They had putting children in ovens was meant not as a sadistic kind of literature, but as a framework for what does that mean symbolically, putting a child in a witch's oven. It's meant to say that there are dark psychic forces that are deeper than the ego. And I think the phenomenon is essentially a call for a mode of knowing that doesn't try to replace the ego, the rational mind, make it wrong, but supplement rationale, supplement rational logic. Go to meta-logical, meta-rational frameworks. And that's where mythology can be very helpful. And sideways thinking, brainstorming. We need more people at UFO conferences who are not just physics and engineers, but anthropologists and psychologists and linguists and poets and ordinary people who work with their hands in the fields, because this phenomenon has not been yielding its secrets based on the way that it has been investigated so far.
Oh, yeah. I've got to comment on that. I mean, you do make a little bit of reference to the way modern science and other fields of so-called knowledge, maybe more dogmas, are so highly specialized that people get into compartments and they don't necessarily see a bigger picture. You draw a much bigger picture than the average researcher of these phenomenon. That's a position I'm able to hold as well as a podcast host, that I might talk about widely diverging subject matters with specialists. But to me, the opposite of the specialist is the generalist. And I feel like we're just adding layers to the thing, and we'll probably need to return to each one of these layers in almost a spiral path But on the subject of being a generalist, well, I think the biggest interest for me, like to back up a little bit, in a footnote from the book, you summarize the idea of abductions taking place in clusters. And that's according to the work of researcher David Jacobs, that the clusters are frequently manifesting around puberty or other sort of transitionary points in someone's life. And for some women, there appears to be a connection between these clusters of abductions and their menstrual cycle, particularly when they're ovulating. And that little detail shows up in Sasquatch reports as well. In my view on the wider phenomenon, not just what appears to be aliens or UFOs, but also the fairies, the leprechauns and gnomes and dwarves and the whole, in the Jacques Vallée sense, the whole nine, going back to as far as human records are kept. I think one of the most overlooked elements that connects all of it, it's cooked into all mythology, both ancient epic poetry and the modern sci-fi style abduction accounts. It's the mystery of the generative power. And in spite of all our measuring and learning, we humans aren't really any closer to knowing our origins, the source of life itself, the self-destructing and self-regenerating power of the cosmos. We're not any closer than our ancestors were. In fact, we're probably further from a meaningful understanding on the whole. And so with phantom pregnancies, hybrid programs at the forefront of these commonalities between experiencers, do you think the non-human intelligence's endless repetition of the same experiments holds up a mirror to our own cognitive fog, enshrouding the mystery of our life force as an eternal continuum?
Whoa, that's a lot. I'm just fixed a bit back in a couple of sentences ago about the mystery of the generative power. Is that the way you put it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what all mythology is allegory too.
Well, it really is. I had the privilege of much of this book, or a fair part of it, is my encounters with people in the field that I got to know, and probably we'll talk about some of them. But one of them was Joseph Campbell. Most of us know his work now through The Hero with 1,000 Faces, that marvelous book he wrote. And Bill Moyers did a marvelous PBS series called The Power of Myth. So Joseph Campbell was the preeminent mythologist of our time, and he had determined, based on studies of all the myths, Greek, Roman, Babylonian, Sumerian, Near East, Far East, Asian Pacific, you name it. I won't even begin. That's just cutting across the surface. He realized there's a myth at the heart of all these myths. He called it the mono-myth, and it has to do with the hero's journey. A hero stumbles forth from the light of day and is called to adventure in some ways, not because he's prepared necessarily, or she, but because just events happen and there's a calling to accomplish some mythic ritual. So I bring in Joseph Campbell's 3-stage model of initiation. And I want to keep it real simple at this point, because you've just talked about the generative power of the universe that mythology touches on. Other cultures in previous times have provided rituals, initiation ceremonies, precisely to teach and to refresh and to rejuvenate the community's myths and understandings through repetition. So in a traditional indigenous society, initiation takes place where the men, and it can be the women too, but I'll just talk about male initiation. The process is that the men of the tribe on a particular night, when the understanding with the women is, okay, tonight's the night, but the boys don't know. What's going to happen is the men arrive at the boys' homes, their own homes. They're wearing masks and regalia, and the boys think it's the gods themselves. And the men spirit the boys away. The women cry and shriek, but they're in on it. They know that this is the time to teach their sons. It is time for the boys to go with the men. And by the way, there are initiation ceremonies for women in indigenous tribes too, for the girls. So there are times when the girls are taken from the family by the women who are addressed as gods. And so the point is, let's stick with the boys. The boys are taken by the mythic figures who are really their own fathers, but they don't know that. At least they don't know it officially. And they're taken to the initiatory hut, and they are trained, they are taught, they're instructed as to the myths of our people. Maybe it's the Dogon people of Africa. I mean, I could name many different communities, Australian indigenous people. Interestingly, almost always the ancestors, and the story is, where do we come from? Where do our ancestors come from? Almost always they come from the sky. So right here, the relevance to the UFO phenomenon, which appears to come from the sky, although it also comes from the water. These craft or paracraft come in and out of water. It's a transmedium phenomenon. So the point here is I bring in Joseph Campbell's initiatory model because in the same sense that boys or girls are taken from their homes and initiated so that the boy becomes a man, the girls become women. Likewise, I think there's an initiation ceremony going on, broadly speaking, metaphorically speaking. Not that the aliens are specifically trying to initiate humans in anything, but the cosmos is introducing humanity to its next level of development. So what Jung talked about, you talked about individuation, the process by which the identity, the ego identity, the limited rational self, job is to increasingly incorporate more of the unconscious and the collective unconscious to create wholeness in the presence of being. So likewise, could it be that the UFO phenomenon is part of a larger initiation? Let
me put one little caveat on individuation for the audience too, but just on a linguistic sense, and then continue, please. That individuation isn't, as we consider it, you becoming set apart from everything else. The word itself, individual, means not divided. So that incurs an inclusion of everything internal and external, not this idea of like, I'm an individual in sort of the American egoic sense. It's about that borderline separating your inner and outer world, becoming more permeable to the point where a real individual is empowered by seeing their inner world reflected in their outer world consistently to the point where they realize their agency over the story.
Absolutely. Individuation is very similar to another I word, integration, bringing that which is cast aside, bringing it in, that which is repressed, returning the repressed, making that material available. And it's not only the personal unconscious that is being brought into the larger sense of self. Oh, my identity can include that too. And in fact, I thrive. I have more energy when I include more of what I have repressed. You know how much work it takes? We don't often know it consciously. But when we've overcome a repression, some sense of holding something away, and whether through therapy or through some life circumstance, we just are invited to include that, how much more energy we're given, the darkness that we were repressing because it didn't fit our self-image. It's actually a source of energy. So, for example, if you ate the last piece of cheesecake and you felt guilty for being greedy and you push that away, oh, everybody else is greedy. No, actually, you were greedy. It's okay. You wanted the extra cheesecake. That's okay. Acknowledge that you sometimes take more than your share. Guess what? You survive, right? That hasn't diminished you. Accepting that part of you is part of you. Well, that also includes the collective unconscious, which by definition is all of the events, all of the history of humankind. You might say it's referred to as, in another framework in Hinduism, as the Akashic record. All information, all wisdom, all knowledge. So individuation, integration means making that ultimately available. So cosmic individuation would be, I think we're getting a kind of I call it a call from the cosmos. The UFO phenomena and the near-death phenomena, psychic phenomena, the whole range of supernormal, supernatural, supernature, which is our true nature, I believe, that I argue. When we take that perspective, these phenomena can be seen as calls from the cosmos or calls from reality at large to include more of what is. It isn't that nature is creating something new in the UFO phenomenon. I think it's actually bringing something that we have pushed away. It's actually inviting us to see something, these beings, these presences didn't just go away during the past 300 years of scientific materialism when they were simply dismissed. The phenomenon didn't get the memo that it doesn't exist. So it continues to exist. I think this is as much about a return to our models of reality, new information, as it is a disclosure. See, the main metaphor now in the UFO field is a disclosure. What does the government know? I think there's actually a remembering going. I think the phenomenon somehow, and I can't, we could delve deeply into this perhaps or explore, but what's being remembered? Well, partly it is that the maps of reality that were once drawn by thinkers like Dante. Dante's vision of heaven and earth and of purgatory were once understood to be part of the whole map of reality. Emanuel Swedenborg, the European mystic, William Blake, the marriage of heaven and hell. This kind of imagery has gone dormant. We've stopped thinking in terms of this larger cosmology, this larger universe that, let's say, Richard Tarnas in a marvelous book called The Passion of the Western Mind, an astrologer and a historian and a psychologist of the world soul. I recommend that book very highly. So there's a lot of good work out there now. It's about this remembering of the larger psyche. And in this book, I contribute to that line of thinking.
Yeah, no, the idea that comes back around again and again is how the physical world is the furthest level of our unconscious. And to bring this back around to the generative power and to the manifestation of the UFO phenomenon coming in the air and the water of UFOs, they're flying through the air or they're coming out of the water. Mythologically speaking, or symbolically speaking, the way that these apparent craft manifest, typically in some sort of glowing orb-like fashion or disc fashion, to me is an immediate symbolic link to the sun itself, which is clearly the source of life energy on our world. But then in the mythos, water was considered to be the dual symbol of the generative principle, because without water, the sun could not generate any life. We need that water. But without the sun, water could not generate any life because it would be, an inert block, the fluidity, the continuum, of water itself requires the solar power. So together, in some elements of the mythos, even the top god is represented as some sort of hybrid of water and fire, which I always took to interpret as almost like lightning or electricity, hence maybe some of the symbolic relevance of a creator or chief deity wielding the Vajra and all that. But back to this idea of repression, how much of repression is enacted by the explaining away of a thing? Like, that is a big part of the deal. When I work in my clinical practice to unrepress some old, stuck emotional energy that might be causing a physical problem. I mean, you alluded to this, but how much energy it takes to hold something at bay actually has a somatic correlate in the muscular tension that is held unconsciously to the point where a person doesn't even know that they're holding some sort of muscular tension. They've even repressed the sensation of that discomfort to the point where once we uncork that, they might be sore in a certain area. The wilder part too, Keith, is in my clinical practice, there's an absolute map of the human energy field, human biology, to specific types of repression. So like a certain, you're talking about that guilt over eating the piece of cheesecake. That's going to correlate into, obviously, guilt actually represents a sacral area, like a second chakra area, the stomach, the generative organs, things of that nature. And there's a straight up map anatomy of different types of repression correlate to different parts of the body, which, so back to this idea of repression as explaining things away, how much of the mysteries of our existence, particularly through astrophysics, have now been explained away to the point where they hold very little awe-inspiring significance to the individual, and how much energy is lost in your experience of day-to-day life, when everything being explained away no longer gives you that just fresh-faced, childlike experience of walking outside. It's a warm day, the sun is shining, and you delete everything you've ever heard or been told about what that thing is, and you just go, wow, that thing, the sun. You know, how much energy is lost in the explaining away is the phenomenon manifesting in this luminescent disc orb shape and coming through the waters as a almost indicator of this is where you're supposed to look. You know, get back to the roots of being wowed by the very faculties of this existence that allow for the existence.
Well, that's a great line of thinking. I use the metaphor of a bobber in fishing. I developed that, and I think I touched on it in the book, but in my previous book, which is no longer in print, called Angels and Aliens, I developed it a little more fully. The idea is that, you know, the fish, a lone fish, a little bit like, say, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, who leads the flock. Well, similarly, a fish one day leads the school, right? The other fish are looking for food, and this fish gets curious and goes a little further than usual and notices something out there. And what it is, it's the water side of what we would know as a bobber. It's it doesn't really know it, but the whole structure is fully round. The reason the fish doesn't know it is because the rest of the bobber is above a surface that it doesn't know exists. The fish is the last to know that it lives in water. And it's only that fish who goes up to the bobber. And by the way, what's connected to the bobber is a hook with a lure. And what is the lure? It's colorful. It's intended to attract the fish. Well, let's say the fish doesn't bite the hook because it would be taken out of the water. But let's say the fish gets close enough to the surface and sees the top of the bobber, but more than that, sees the atmosphere. Sees for the first time that the edge of the water is a division between this realm and that realm. So the fish scurries back to the rest of the school and says, we live in water. We live in water. This is just one medium. Well, at first he sounds like he's crazy. He takes some of the other fish, and by then the fisherman is gone, the bobber is gone. So the bobber, UFOs are the same shape as a bobber. They appear at the very surface of being, the edge of being, so to speak. You know, you may remember that when Magellan and Columbus and other the Spanish explorers, conquistadors, were looking at the New World, their maps of this world included areas marked off as beyond here be the sea serpents. That's what their maps actually said. The sea serpents are out there. Guess what? They never really found sea serpents. What sea serpents stood for was the edge beyond which we've never gone. The bobber is the edge beyond which we've never gone. So the fish comes back and says, we live in water. I now know we live in water because there's something that is not water. So that metaphor, it's a metaphor, right? It's a figure of speech. To think of the UFO as a bobber that is trying to catch our attention, or at least that's the effect. So we're focused on the bobber right now, by and large. Are they real? Are they not? What are they made of? Are they made of metal? Are they made of mind? But what's the bobber at the surface of? And I think what at the surface of is a larger super nature, larger normal nature, larger realm of being, which we already have access to because we are multidimensional now. But we've convinced ourselves that we live in 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time only. And it turns out we can get along pretty well most of the time doing that. But we could go anywhere from here, but you probably know some of the work of Donald Hoffman, the cognitive scientist. You may have heard of him, who is actually now concluding that time and space as we know it are doomed. They are part of our perceptual apparatus. Time and space, consciousness doesn't exist in time and space. Time and space is a bubble in consciousness. And likewise, that's the reason we don't understand, or a big part of why we don't understand what UFOs are about, is because we don't know what time and space are about. We think time and space is the last word. But even in string theory right now, that school of physics, it's advocating that we have anywhere from 11 to 26 additional dimensions that are already here. So A big part of what I argue in this book is living into our larger multidimensional nature, for which there's much evidence in normal society that we have capacities that we don't live into. And that's what your work is about, for sure.
Man, this is going to open up a whole nother big subject that we'll have to save for part 2 about how our expectations inform our experience of reality or our perceptions. That's a huge thing. But maybe in our remaining minutes of the first half, I would love it, because you're talking about experiencing our multidimensional nature, if you could share your veridical NDE experience that fateful day and your totality grok from that experience.
Well, I'll tell you, part of what I want to share about that is that I actually wasn't sure whether to bring it into the book. I wrote my first book, Angels and Aliens, based on the premise that, because I'm dealing with a marginal subject, in order to get maximum credibility, I should not indicate that I've had any experience of non-ordinary reality myself. As I look back, it was marvelously naive idea that I would have more credibility if I could purport to have an objectivity that was almost omniscient. The idea that one's own experiences of the anomalous experiences should be off the table. Well, in this book, I didn't do that. So yes, I will try to keep it brief since we're closing out this section. But when I was in my 20s, I went to Hawaii with friends, and we went body surfing one day, and I got carried away in some pretty serious waves on the north coast of Oahu. And the riptide was very intense. I was not aware of how riptides work. Long story short, I got pulled out very far and very hard, got slammed by waves, and there came to be a period when I got really hit by a big wave coming into the shore, like a Hawaii 5-0 type surfing wave, the kind that the surfers long for. And it knocked me flat. And I hit the bottom of the ocean, at the bottom of below the surface, the sand below. And with that thud, I thought, I'm going to die. And I had already been struggling very hard, again, and physically exhausted. I then found myself rising up and momentarily thought, well, I'm coming back to the surface. But what in fact I was rising above was the surface of the water. And I found myself never having heard of an out-of-body experience. It's not part of my literature. I had not delved into psycho-spiritual type things. I hadn't read Robert Monroe's book, Journeys Out of the Body. And so I didn't know what was going on, but I felt myself leaving my body through the back of the head, looking at my body in the ocean, looking at friends on the shore, looking at the body. That was Keith. And I saw that it was Keith, but that couldn't be Keith because I am the I that used to think it was living inside that body. And I went further up and further out, and I remember having the thought. It was probably the most peaceful thought I'd ever had, which it turns out to be a very common response in the near-death experience. I said, oh, dead isn't dead. It's not the end. We think it's the end. It's the end for that body. And that's okay. It was perfectly okay. And the key with what happened, in addition to, by the way, I had never heard of the near-death experience. I'm old enough that Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, had been published, but it wasn't well known. It had not yet been made famous. It was not yet a bestseller. It was on its way to becoming. So in my 20s, I didn't know anything about near-death experiences. I didn't know about the tunnel. I didn't know about seeing departed relatives. I didn't know about the reliving, reviewing your life in totality of detail. And so in any case, I don't know quite how it happened, but apparently it wasn't my time, as they say. I found myself back in my body, in a cove with 2 dolphins escorting me or by my side. And I did not know at the time either that dolphins were safe, had the role of marine animals, helping people survive. One more detail about this. While I was out, if you will, before I came back, my friend Mary, who was part of this expedition of coming to Hawaii for fun, she was standing on the edge of the ocean with our friend Moore. And she was saying with about as much volume to her voice as I'm talking right now, why didn't he listen? I told him to be careful. I told him it wasn't safe. I told her it was too dangerous. So she was anguished. She was losing her friend. It was pretty clear that Keith was kaput. So I went to Mary. I don't know what I mean when I say that, but my presence, my sense, I went to Mary and I said, no, it's okay. I'm okay. You're okay. Life is okay. I won't be back, but that's okay. Everything's cool. And I felt that truth more deeply than I felt anything. She couldn't hear me. I realized, I guess that's if you're dead, you can hear them, but they can't hear you. So I came into the cove. My friends pulled me out. They talked with me and made sure that cuts and bruises. I wasn't greatly damaged by all counts. One of my friends turned to me and said, wow, man, we thought you'd given it up out there. And I had such a lucid sense of presence. I said, wow, you understand. You know what happened. I did give it up. I died. I went to death, and I came back. And likewise, they didn't know about their death phenomenon. None of us did. So they could only think Keith is delirious. I looked at their faces and I said, oh, they think I'm delirious. I was not only not delirious, I was more lucid than I'd ever been. So I instantly got the message. This isn't something to talk about casually. You will become a crazy person. You will be seen as a crazy person. So to summarize this, the next day, after I survived and sort of recovered and had a good hot bath and food, I asked my friend Mary, could you go for a walk with me? She said, sure. What's up? I said, well, let's talk with me. So I said, I heard what you said yesterday. She said about what? At the shore. Why didn't he listen? I told him it was too dangerous. Why did he go out? I told him to be careful. Chance, her face just drained blood. She went blank. She went pale because she and I both knew, even though we were in our 20s, we both knew that what I was describing meant my ability to have overheard her I was not listening to her from the body. There was a non-local communication, very similar to what NDE people report when they come back from surgery, and they describe a psychic communication many miles away or close. So that was a big marker for me. That changed the game board for me big time. I was already interested in UFOs, but it changed my whole framework about life. And I decided, absolutely, I'm bringing that into the book because many near-death, many UFO people, witnesses have the same dilemma. They don't trust that they can describe what they've been through without sounding crazy.
Yeah, that story was really amazing. And it was, to me, like emotional to reach the conclusion of your book where things kind of come full circle. And Mary, your friend, is going through the dying process. And there's this emergence of recognition about what the Greek philosopher Plotinus called the paradigma, like the greater pattern encompassing one's whole destiny, that your relationship with her always was leading you toward that moment at the end of her life where that time from your 20s could be recalled back into your awareness, and that her transition from life could be made easier by your witness, you being there for her, you telling her dead isn't dead, like that was a intense full circle way to close out the book. And I like that we can conclude part one of our conversation with that. And we'll have to investigate that idea of the innate image, the basic pattern of one's destiny, more in part two. But how can people find your work, Keith? Is there anything besides this UFO Paradox book you want them to know about? Closing thoughts for the free hour?
Yeah, I'm at on Twitter, or X as it's now called, with my full name, Keith Thompson, number 1, just the numeral 1, Keith Thompson 1. And I have a website called thompsonatlarge.com, Thompson with a P, THOMPSON, atlarge.com. That's how to reach me. And the book can be ordered there. It's available in print, ebook, and also now as an audiobook.
Good stuff. I hope people check it out. If they like these subjects, they're going to get a lot out of it. And thanks for being here, man. Looking forward to pulling more threads in part 2.
Okay, me too. Let's get at it soon.
Yes, and yes. Loved that conversation. I had a lot of juice going into it. I'm going to be honest. I feel like I'm getting like dad health kicking in. Something's shifting, and maybe it's because the sun has reached my first house and I'm getting like the identity overhaul, whatever, but I feel great. And I had so much enthusiasm to talk to Keith because I think I mentioned this off the air, but, you know, I get a lot of books across my desk as a host, and I even seek out authors, right, as part of my job. So I'm reading a lot of books. Many times it's stuff that I'm kind of familiar or very familiar with already, so sometimes my reading of somebody's book is more like skimming for the nuggets that I want to bring out into a conversation. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it works just fine. I don't need to reread material that is something I've already come across before multiple times in order to have a good ability to comment on it or appreciate that they included it in their book. But Keith, he's a great writer. He's a really good writer, man. And I read every word of his book. There was no skimming. And I loved that. And so I was super in the zone to talk to him after going through that material. And I think you guys would get a lot out of it, especially you of the philosophical bent. I think that's the education that makes more sense out of all these phenomenon than anything else is the philosophical. And Keith does that. He does that really well. Or the mythological. I mean, those two things kind of go hand in hand, right? So if you liked this conversation and you want to hear the second part, because the second part is really good, we go deep, you know, get on my Patreon or my YouTube or my Rockfen. All of that stuff is going to be linked in the show notes. But Patreon's $5 a month. It's a great deal. You get everything I ever put out there. And in the second half of this conversation, I reckon we went about an hour and 10 minutes. We talked about the shape-shifting Proteus, the protean nature of the phenomenon, the way that facts and fiction change their clothes. Really fun stuff. And, you know, talked about how our perception of reality is tempered by our expectations. I feel like there's a lot more meat on those bones, but we definitely got into that. Talked about the limits of empiricism and the scientism dogma being a religious dogma. I don't think I can really even encompass all of the good stuff in part 2, but maybe the most interesting part of the whole thing was talking about human capacities that are not recognized by the normal experience of reality, but that for many people are normal. These would be like self-regulation, bodily regulation abilities, extrasensory perception, telepathic communication, things of, you know, experiences of almost like divinely inspired energy. There's a whole range of these things. He goes through them in the book, but how basically what the Hindu tradition calls cities and how other traditions talk about the different powers of various layers of our body and our energy body and our psyche, that maybe some of the bizarre things that happen in the abduction phenomenon, like levitation, getting levitated out of your bed and loaded through a wall, well, maybe there's something to do with our own human potential, our own repressed potential that breaks through the fences of our trying to push it aside sometimes and forces us to recognize it, even though it's through the allegory of being abducted. I think there's a big there. So these bizarre psychophysical phenomena that go with the abduction scenario, we definitely got into that. We talked about after death, consciousness retention. We talked about missing time in the abductions. So much there. So that's a short list, but it's big. It's much bigger. And I hope you guys do get into the second part. Do join my Patreon. Like I said, I'm becoming a dad. So, you know, sending me $5, I think is a good deed. And there's lots of delicious content for you to get into. So there were things from his book, Keith's book, that I would have loved to talk about, but, you know, there's different strokes for different folks, right? Some interview guests, I really stick to my outline. Other times it's a pure conversational flow state. And with a new person, I'd have a prepared outline, but I also I see how it goes with the flow. And Keith is a flow guy. He was definitely good at that part. As you probably noticed in the first hour, how, we almost talked about kind of peripheral ideas more than the weird, high strangeness, abduction, UFO stuff itself. And in the book, I really like how, as a mythology, and Keith's constant referring to the encounters people have had and the sightings people have had as a mythology, that he starts with the genesis story of UFOs itself, the Keith Arnold case. And he cleverly explains in the book how the fence that separates mythological and historical stories also keeps them connected, but the border is porous. Yet another example of Hermes, trickster prevailing over Apollo's insistence on clear-cut categories. And how he examined that case in the book definitely is something I've heard of before, because I've looked at this material for like 10 years. But he brought up that what Keith actually reported, Keith Arnold, not Keith Thompson. Interesting that they're both named Keith, though. What Keith Arnold reported of, I think, 9 craft that he saw, that the reporting on the account differed from the account itself. That what he actually said was that there were these 9 objects that were glowing, intense, like a bright light flash, like a welder's arc, that they moved like saucers. But then the guy who broke the story, the reporter, said that they were saucers or saucer-shaped. So it's an example of how the first story that people hear is the one that is remembered, and how this is the genesis moment for the whole UFO phenomenon that really popped off in 1947. I mean, a floodgate of activity. 1947, interesting year. Does that have anything to do with the end of World War II? Or breakaway navigators, breakaway technology? I don't know. But they leave things out of that Genesis account, like how Keith Arnold thought that the UFOs that he saw come from the world where we go when we die. That's kind of a big deal. Kind of a big deal. And then, so the book is worth it just to get sort of like the anthology of greatest hits. It's not as inclusive of every little minute story. A lot of it is like the big picture details, the commonalities he gets into. But there are a few cases that he goes into deep analysis of that he finds to be super profound. And I love that. Like the Keith Arnold case, like this case in Zimbabwe where a group of school children in the 90s saw a craft land near their school and a weird creature come out of it. And what I love too about him bringing up these cases is that, having been someone who dialogued with Joseph Campbell in his life, he draws these inferences about the UFO phenomenon and how it mirrors the monomythic pattern, and how this encounter or witness experience that people have, it represents them having to like go into the wilderness of the unknown to like leave their society behind in a way, if they're going to embrace the truth of what they saw. And he calls these heroes' journeys that encounterers, experiencers go on, refers to them as a signal of transcendence that they receive, and they have to go follow it. It's really fun. And I love that we talked about UFOs as allegorical and nature, physical reality as allegorical. He does a really good job fleshing that out in the book. Kind of a hard thing to encompass in a 2-hour conversation, but it's worth reading the book for this aspect. And listeners to me, they know that I talk about this a lot, but I take issue with the more sort of pop culture Gnosticism versus the real initiated experience of a Gnostic reality, meaning knowing, witnessing, unfiltered, unbridled truth. But the more traditional religious experience of so-called Gnosticism tends to get swept up in what I consider to be an ancient form of materialist reductionism that, makes what the modern sci-fi materialism calls simulation theory, more spiritual description, that the world is an illusion and all that. And I tweak that. I think that reality is not an illusion, it's an allusion. And it alludes to more than just the physical, the metaphysical. It alludes to reality, external reality alludes to your inner world reality. But illusion, it ain't. Definitely not. Something's happening. You're here, I'm here, something's happening. And I appreciate how this book supports that particular theory of mine. Another thing that's interesting about Keith is he had a friendship with Lawrence Rockefeller, like Rockefeller. And in the 90s was part of the Rockefeller Disclosure Initiative trying to petition Bill Clinton to disclose. But I like how Keith recognizes in his book the disclosure thing itself as part of the mythos. And that, he's not really one of those people that's making this claim of someday we're going to have disclosure. It's all going to make sense. And we're going to have the technology and med beds and, all of our problems will be solved once the government releases the secret alien tech. No, he sees it more realistically, which seems more, in a way is more woo. He also talks about how, he had this thought of, well, if there's alien human hybrids, shouldn't they show up on 23andMe? And, they don't unless that data is being filtered out. All around a great book, having a lot of fun with the sort of theme that is following between Mark Dober and Keith Thompson. And maybe we'll do more on this stuff in the future. I mean, it's kind of an endless source of at least stories and experience reports to talk about UFO stuff. And if you're new to the channel or semi-new, I recommend going through the archives. Going to my website maybe, just scrolling through the archives, pick something, sounds interesting. Like this show, most of our content, my content, I should say, is timeless. It's going to hold up whether it's 5 years old or 5 days old. So if you like this, you want more, go see what's there, pick something out, enjoy it. And thanks for digging in those archives because they need some love too. I think often about ways to better categorize the different types of content that we've done here, because I really don't want some of these profound gems of shows like this one to get swept into the dustbin of yesterday. So help me out, make me feel better. Let me know in our Telegram group if you watched an older episode and what you thought of it, or what you think of this episode. The Telegram channel is going to be linked in the episode description too. Great community, really good vibes. Never even have to ban anybody except occasionally bots, but hey, that's everywhere. There's also biofield tuning to consider. I've recently revamped the website to have a lot more free information about your biofield and how that works. And the ability to purchase a session through the website, much simpler, much more simple process to get yourself on my schedule. And I alluded to a couple tuning stories in this episode. Powerful stuff, always is. But in particular, the synchronicity of the woman with her mother-in-law that I referred to was very cool. Very cool. They never get old. It never gets mundane to me, the level of magic available to us, especially when we do these practices, these holistic, energetic practices like biofield tuning that help us straddle the line between physical and spiritual or mental, between the inner and the outer, between the past and the future. It's great. So I love y'all. Thanks for tuning in. I think I said everything I want to say. There's affiliates and such that you might want to support the show through too. I have to mention those. I mean, Tippecanoe Herbs is life, and their stuff is the best. Use the InnerVerse coupon code. Get yourself some herbal, magical remedies and enjoy that. And I'm out of here. Catch you guys on the next one. Thanks for listening. I love you. Bye-bye.